What's up, everyone? Welcome into DodgerHeads Live, presented by DodgerBlue.com. My name is Jeff Spiegel. That is Justin Lorber. We've got a great show for you. Again, this is DodgerHeads Live, presented by DodgerBlue.com, your home for the 2020 World Series champion. Justin, again, is our prospect expert joining us. And so here's the plan for tonight. We're going to start the show in just a moment by breaking down the Dodgers' top 10 prospect lists. He released his top 100, so we're going to get into that. And then we'll get into our typical week in review stuff as well. Stock up, stock down, big deal, no deal, that kind of thing. But if you've got prospect questions, hang on to those. We'll take them in a little bit. But before we do any of that, Justin, welcome. I know today's a big day for you. You release your 2021 edition of the Dodgers Top 100 Prospects. I imagine it's a huge undertaking. So how does it feel to have that beast out of there?
It's good. It's definitely good. Not as good as seeing Archie Miller fired from the Indiana Hoosiers basketball team. So that was probably a little better, but both are a big relief.
Good. Well, we got our first comment on here saying, hey, we appreciate Justin's Twitter page. It's helped me get into the prospects. So I know you said off the air, that's part of the thing you love is being able to provide free content for people to be able to get into this kind of thing. So I know I appreciate that. I know the folks that are going to be watching tonight appreciate that as well. And yes, as a basketball fan, again, I can appreciate, not liking a coach, getting rid of him. And this isn't going to turn into a Dave Roberts thing, all right? All the commenters who want to get all fired up about this is not a Dave Roberts parallel to what's going on in Indiana. But yeah, we're excited to have you. I'm excited to talk prospects. You're the guy who knows this system about as well as anybody outside of the Dodger organization. And so before we get into the individual names here, I guess I want to start with a big picture question of how would you grade kind of the overall state of the Dodger prospect pool? Talking about guys like Lux, May, Gonsolin, Gratterall, Rios, Santana, Gonzalez, all graduated. They've added some guys via some small trades, nothing major, I would say, some international signings, the draft. Where does that movement leave them big picture in your mind?
So I think it's weird because you have a system that is moving down and up at the same time. On the one hand, they've lost a bunch of that upper level talent, like you've said. And I like you putting me as the biggest person on the
Sorry
screen
for
while
the
I'm
video
talking.
issues we're having here.
So they've lost those guys. They've lost a lot of those high end guys, but they added so much depth, I think, in the last year between guys who have developed and guys they've brought into the system. The system is arguably as deep as it's been maybe ever, at least in the last 5 or so years since Andrew Friedman and the rest of the front office took over and, kind of underwent a retooling of not just the major league system, but the minor league system.
Yeah, I mean, and that seems like a big thing is depth is the priority. I know as a Dodger fan in the past, you go to these top 100 lists and National Piece puts out, and you're looking at 5, 6 guys in the top 100, whereas this year, it's down to about 3 in most places, maybe 4, it seems like. But to your point, as we get into so the plan is we're going to do the top 10 tonight, and we'll do kind of 11 through 100 with a focus on 11 through 30 mostly, but the rest next week. And what fascinated me, originally this was going to be a one show deal. We were just going to say, hey, let's talk about it. But when I even get down to 21 through 30, I mean, the names that are in that list, the names that are in 31 to 40, those are segments of the prospect list that I think the average person would say, I don't know anything about. And then you realize like, well, DJ Peters is halfway through 20 to 30, and Landon Knack, who was their, first or second round pick a year ago, isn't in the top 20. And you've got guys like Garrett Clevenger, who might be a serious contributor at the major league level, hovering down closer to 50. So when you talk about depth, I mean, is that what you're talking about? Just it's instead of focusing on a small group of prospects that are going to be superstars, it feels like the Dodgers have 30 or 40 potential like major league contributors in this organization.
So I think that's a close to correct number of guys who you could realistically see as contributing in the major leagues. Their depth is twofold. One, it allows them to make trades and trade from quantity rather than quality that sometimes other teams can't do. We saw that, for example, with the Manny Machado trade when they moved 5 prospects, really only one elite prospect in Yusniel Diaz, and had a couple injuries. He hasn't blossomed yet. But the other side of it is they've done such a good job of using that depth and taking guys from that depth and turning them into elite prospects. So guys like Gavin Lutz, who, was a mid-round, first-round pick. Michael Busch was not picked in the first 30 picks. He was right after the first round. They've turned those guys, Dustin May, third-round pick, Tony Gonsolin, ninth-round pick, just more examples of guys who were depth that they turned into not just elite prospects, but useful, contributable major leaguers. And Michael Busch isn't there yet, but he's someone who I'm really high on personally. And this is the kind of thing that they do. They build up the depth and then they turn that depth into impact players. So it's not just depth to have depth.
Right.
It's actually useful depth.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I do think, you could say, as a Dodger fan, over the last 3 or 4 years, as they have built out the organization, it's gotten to a point where you look at I don't think as a Dodger fan I've ever been worried about the last 5 spots on the 40-man roster until the last few years. And now it's getting to the point where every time the Rule 5 comes up, I'm like, dang it, we're about to just lose some of these guys for nothing, because the Dodgers are just so deep and so loaded. And obviously, look, the guys that just missed the top 40, could they be contributors? Sure, but probably not to the level of a World Series champion in the mind of Andrew Friedman. But to your point, that is what has made it so fascinating, is the abundance of depth. It's like we just want to buy up all the lottery tickets and see what happens. So one other thing big picture, before we really take a deep dive in this top 10, is looking at positional scarcity versus positional abundance. For example, left-handed pitching is non-existent in the Dodgers, at the top of the Dodger list. According to you, of the 16 top pitching prospects in the Dodger system, 15 of them are right-handed. 15 of the top 16. This is an organization famous for Sandy Koufax and Clayton Kershaw as left-handers. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got catchers. The Dodgers have a budding superstar at the major league level. Will Smith, who used to be on this list, has graduated. So they have a 25-year-old cornerstone at catcher, and yet they have 2 more catchers in the top 7, plus a third who's in the top 30 they just signed internationally. So from your perspective, as you look big picture, how much of that stuff matters? Like does it matter to say, oh, they've got 15 righties and 1 lefty, or too many catchers? Like, does that stuff actually ever become an issue in your mind?
No, I don't think so. With the lefty righty thing, sometimes that's just how it works out. Uh, you need lefties and righties, and you need to differentiate them at the major league level, especially in the bullpen, because late in games you want to match up and you want to get the best matchup for your reliever. But that's just 1 or 2 guys. So the difference between the number of lefties and righties at the top of the system, I don't think is that relevant. With regard to catching, you can never have too many catchers. With the state of catching in the game right now, at least until we get or move towards some kind of robotic strike zone, framing is valuable, and guys who can play defense behind the plate and hit is extremely valuable. And the Dodgers have 3 guys in Will Smith, Keibert Ruiz, and Diego Cartaya who project to be, major league starters. And that's really valuable. Whether they end up pairing them together, like we saw with Austin Barnes and Yasmani Grandal in 2017, statistically on a per at-bat basis, those were 2 of the 5 best catchers in baseball. Yeah. And it's one of the big reasons why the Dodgers were one of the best teams in baseball that year. Probably should have won a World Series for reasons that we know now. So too many catchers is not a good thing. And look, worst case scenario, you develop too many catchers and you trade one for another spot on the roster that you need to fill in.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I mean, Ruiz is the guy that has been talked about, so I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit. So let's get into the list. And I've got one more question before we start talking specific names. And this is a question that it might sound simple, but I actually think is really complicated as well. And the short version is, before we look at these rankings, what does it mean to say that player A is ranked ahead of player B? So that's like the short version. Does it mean player A has a higher ceiling? Does it mean he has a lower chance of busting? Does it mean he's closer to the majors? And the perfect example for me in this estimation is Zach McKinstry. So as we'll find out in a second, Zach McKinstry is your 10th ranked prospect in the Dodger organization, which you have higher than the average person, by the way. But this is a guy who I think a lot of people, you and I both included, think is going to make the major league roster, the opening day roster, I should say. And yet, he's the number 10 prospect. He's behind a 17-year-old who probably won't be even playing stateside baseball for another year at least, maybe longer. So the short version is, what does it mean to say that Zach McKinstry is number 10 on this list and not number 11 or number 9?
Roughly, it is, I would trade this player for this player.
Okay.
And, a lot of them are very close. The difference between players 9 and 10 and 10 and 11 are small. The difference between 1 and 20 or 20 and 60, those are bigger.
Yeah.
But if you're just looking at a 1-spot difference, that's a pretty small difference. And, that's an area where even within 5 or 10 spots, reasonable people can differ. Zach McKinstry, I think, is a really good example. And I'm glad you brought him up because, when you're doing any kind of rankings with prospects, you're weighing upside and you're weighing certainty.
Yeah.
I think this player is going to be this, but how wide is that variance? How wide is that range? You brought up 17-year-old Wilman Diaz. If he were American, he would be a junior in high school. He wouldn't be drafted until next summer. So his range of outcomes is, doesn't even make it to A-ball to potential major league superstar.
Yeah.
Whereas Zach McKinstry is a guy who, probably not going to be a major league superstar, but there's a really high certainty that he's going to be a major league contributor, at least in some kind of bench utility role. And he can do that immediately this season. So it's not just certainty and upside, but it's also how close are they. So he's a guy right now, this season, can be a contributing bench bat on a championship team. And, that's also where you add in, I think, a little bit of the quote unquote Dodgers factor in how well they've gotten the most out of those type of players. Your Matt Beatty's, your Edwin Rios's, the guys who, might be bench players, might be starters on different teams, but they've been able to get the most out of them.
Yeah. Okay. So the short version is it's sort of a combination. It's a secret sauce mixture of how high is the ceiling, how low is the floor, and how close are they to majors. Would you say those are kind of the three sort of variables that primarily figure in here?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Well, let's get
I think if you were...
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I think a better word for floor, just because the ideas of floors and ceilings are kind of changing.
Fair.
With where we're moving in development, where you can have a 26-year-old or a 28-year-old develop a new pitch or adjust his swing and reach a whole new level of ceiling.
Yeah.
I think if you had asked any scout when Chris Taylor was in the draft, what is his power ceiling? I don't think they would have said 25, 30 home runs.
Yeah.
But on a team other than the Dodgers, which he might be next year because he's a free agent following this season, if he's playing every day and he's getting 600 at bats, he should hit 25, 30 home runs.
Yeah.
And that's because he changed who he was after he was drafted and when he was a little older than the average prospect. And because we're seeing a lot more of that now with the state of modern player development, it is kind of redefining this, traditional definition of ceilings and floors. So that's one more note I did want to add to that.
Yeah.
And because the Dodgers have been so prominent in that area with some of these guys that they've taken on from other teams and helped reach their max potential.
Fair enough. Well, let's get to the top 10. We'll put it up here on the screen. Here's the Dodgers top 10 prospects. Again, this is Justin's list. You could check this out at his website, futuredodgers.wordpress.com, I believe. Is that right? Do I have the order wrong?
Yeah, and just type in futuredodgers.com and it'll redirect as well.
futuredodgers.com. He's got his whole top 100. He's got an opening day projection, so definitely check that out. But here's his top 10 prospects. Number 1, Josiah Gray. K-Bear Ruiz, number 2. Michael Busch, number 3. Bobby Miller, number 4. Ryan Pepio, number 5. Andy Pages. We were joking beforehand. There is a wide range of possible pronunciations there. We'll go with Pages, which was mentioned on the broadcast this week. Diego Cartaya, number 7. Wilman Diaz at 8. Cody Hosey at 9. Zach McKinstry, number 10. So I got some questions to walk us through these, Justin. Josiah Gray, the number 1 guy, according to most sites out there, basically a consensus number 1. Ruiz is pretty much a consensus number 2, and I would say Michael Busch is probably a consensus number 3. Outside of those threes, it feels like there's a lot of variation once you get past those, but all 3 of those guys are in the top 3 or maybe 4 of every single list. So if you were creating, I'll start by asking this. If you were creating tiers, sometimes we just see a list and number 2 is just as close to number 3 as 9 is close to 10. What would the tiers look like? I mean, are those top 3 guys in a tier of their own? Does Miller join them? Is Gray in his own tier? Where would you break down various tiers that might exist in this top 10?
I would say there's a soft tier between 3 and 4, like you said. Those top 3 guys, just in terms of how close they are to the majors, and I think the level of certainty that they can provide some kind of impact, puts them a tier above everyone else. And then if I were to do another tier, maybe I would cut it off at 8 or 9. I'm not sure, either between 8 or 9 and between 9 and 10. I'd probably put another soft tier. Okay.
Well, let's go through these, and we'll start with the pitchers. We got Josiah Gray, Bobby Miller, Ryan Pepio. Gray, of course, comes over in exchange for Puig and Kemp, along with some others, as part of the Reds trade. That might, with Jeter Downs was part of that. That might be one of the best trades in Dodger history. Not a trade anybody was necessarily expecting to be the best at the time. Miller was the team's number 1 pick just a year ago, and Pepio was their 3rd rounder in 2019. So I'll give you some space to break these down, but how would you kind of describe the high end versions of the best versions of themselves, the best possible outcome, as well as maybe a realistic expectation for the three of them?
Sure. Okay. So let's start with Josiah Gray. Let's start at the top. He's a guy who has only really been pitching for a few years. I
Mm-hmm.
know you know that because you did your interview with him very recently. But he's a guy who, aside from the stuff and how athletic he is, the plus arm speed that he's shown, he's a guy who's only been pitching full time for like 4 years. And so you have the added upside of, sure, I think he's 23. He's got a great fastball, developing slider, developing changeup, but he's only been pitching for a full time for a few years.
Yeah.
And so the more he pitches, just the better he's going to be. And you give a little extra bump to guys like that who are the converted position players. And we've seen guys like Jacob deGrom just get better and better and better the more they pitch. So he's someone who I'm high on. And I think a lot of organizations, he would already be either in a major league starting rotation or would be in one by midseason. And he can come up and be a back end mid rotation starter pretty soon.
And is
As
the is,
for
is the high end for Gray? I mean, are we talking a potential number one pitcher? Are we talking like a Walker Bueller type, or are we more talking maybe in the like Tony Gonsolin mold?
I think the high end for Gray depends a lot on how his secondary stuff comes along. His fastball's great. Mid 90s, I think he's touched 98 before,
Jeez.
got right at the top of the zone. He knows how to locate it well, and he knows how to get swings and misses with it in and above the zone, which is, very key in today's game. So depending on how well his slider comes along, depending on how well his changeup comes along, will determine whether he's a back end starter
Okay,
or a number two, number three, or maybe even a high leverage reliever.
got it. Okay, what about Miller? So Miller, it's pretty crazy for a guy who was picked a year ago to be number four in a system as deep and as powerful as the Dodgers. I remember talking to you on the night of the draft, which was a fascinating night because the Dodgers picked Beater, which was a guy you were a lot higher on, I think, sort of going into the draft, if I remember correctly. But a lot of people seem impressed with Bobby Miller. You, I think, mentioned him as a potential number two starter down the road as kind of a projection for him. So talk to me a little bit about him.
Yeah, if you're going to pick a guy with top of rotation upside in this system, it's Bobby Miller.
Mm.
He's a guy who not only looks like a number one or two starter, but has the stuff to be a number one or two starter. Mid to upper 90s fastball, throws a four seamer and a two seamer. His best secondary is his slider, but he's been working on his changeup. I know he adopted a spiked curveball grip either in the fall or the summer. I don't remember exactly. But this is a guy who, very limited spring training action we've seen him in and a little bit last summer. But he got great reviews in the fall during instructs. He's worked on his delivery. He's become more athletic. His arm action is shortened up a little bit. And the arrow is just pointing straight up with him.
Okay. And I mean, yeah, that's exciting, obviously, for Dodger fans. You mentioned it. I mean, with any of these guys, were any of these rankings impacted by spring training?
Yes, a little bit. And it's more than usual because we haven't seen a lot of these guys in a year and a half.
Sure.
For example, a guy like Ryan Pepio, heard last summer, heard in the fall, heard, right before the season started, this guy pitched like a monster at the alt site, more fastball velocity. The changeup is elite. But just getting to see that in person, or not in person, but
Yeah.
live on video for the first time in, a year and a half, really,
Yeah.
bumped him up, a spot or two, I think. And there are individual scenarios where guys moved up a spot or two, nothing drastic. And I think in a normal year, probably wouldn't have happened.
So let's get to Pepio because he's the biggest riser on your board. This is a guy who I think was number 23 maybe at your midseason report last year. You kind of mentioned he was a third round pick. We haven't really seen much of him, but then the stuff coming out of the alternate side, I interviewed Josiah Gray, who said the same thing, Dave Roberts, plus changeup, best pitcher at the alternate side. I mean, the reviews on this guy are through the roof. I actually joked that right now I think he might be one of the 6 best relief pitchers in the entire Dodger organization. Like if they just put him on the big league roster, I think he might be that good. That's probably hyperbole on my point. What do you think about Pepio? I guess one question I want to get to is he a starter long term? I've seen some debate on that front. We know the changeup. Maybe people just see Devin Williams and want to go straight to reliever. But talk to me about what changed for Pepio and is he a starting pitcher long term?
So in terms of what changed over the last year, he increased his fastball velocity. He
Okay.
was a guy who sat in the low 90s, touched mid 90s. Now he's sitting mid 90s, maybe touching 96, 97.
Mm.
That's a change, especially when you have a secondary offering as good as his changeup is. It's a truly elite changeup. It was maybe the best changeup in the 2019 draft. That fastball will really help that,
Yeah.
and they help each other. Additionally, fastball vertical movement gets misses at the top of the zone and above the zone. That's where baseball is moving. These guys who can throw fastballs in the zones for whiff because it helps your secondary stuff play up and you get more strikeouts, which is where the game is headed. I think he's a starter, and I know that a lot of people in the Dodgers organization believe so as well. I've been told that one higher ranking Dodgers pitching person believes he's actually their best arm on the minor league side.
Wow.
So he's a really exciting guy, and I think he's a starter. If he can develop that third offering, which is his slider, I think he will. And if he can throw enough strikes, which I think he will.
That's impressive. That's impressive. That's exciting because this is a guy that I think a lot of people just sort of like, penciled into the bullpen, and there's no shame in that. Again, I think if he were, he would be an elite reliever, but obviously if you can turn him into a middle of the rotation starter, that will always be more valuable. This is the Julio Urias debate that is going on in Dodger circles. Why don't they just make him the closer? Well, because guess what? As a starter, he will always be more valuable, and you can make him a closer for the World Series run if you would like to, but that's exciting there. So let's get to the offensive side of things. We'll get to Ruiz here in a moment, but Michael Busch, for people that maybe are new to the prospect game, like as far as in 2021, Busch is a guy that feels like the biggest riser. He was kind of hovering around the back half of the top 10, maybe early in the 11 to 15 range. You had him number 7 midway through the season, but now he's a top 100 guy. Almost everywhere you look, it feels like. What has the shift been with him? And I know some of the debate is, can he stick at second base or is he a first baseman? It feels like they believe in him as a second baseman. Does he stick there? And 2022, is that the ETA?
I think so, and I think that's an ETA. So coming out of college, 2019 draft, he was a guy who was one of the best hitters in the draft, but really had only played first base and corner outfield at North Carolina. He played a little bit of second base in the Cape Cod League. For those who don't know, that is the elite summer prospect league where the best college players in a normal non-pandemic year go play college or go play summer ball. And he played second base a little bit there, but it wasn't a place where most people saw him. The Dodgers announced him as a second baseman, which surprised me, surprised a lot of people. But they really do believe in him as a second baseman. And if he can stick there, he has the offensive upside to be one of the best 5 or 10 second basemen in the game. If you're like me and you are prone to bumping up guys just a little bit who have a great approach to the plate and who walk a bunch, you're going to like Michael Busch because that's what he is. Baseball America reported last fall that he earned universal reviews as the best hitter in Arizona. So that's across all the different Arizona teams' instructional league rosters. And that's big because he's facing guys who, are AA and AAA pitchers, and he's only ever played at low A. Obviously, he saw some advanced pitching at the alt site last summer, but for a guy who hasn't even played high A yet, that's big. Yeah. And like you said, if he can stick at second base, this is going to be a really impactful major league player and one who probably the Dodgers will move around because we know how much the Dodgers love their positional versatility.
Yeah, and it is interesting because you look at the major league level and you kind of, are plotting out, okay, if the ETA is 2022, well, you've got Gavin Lux, who seems to be the starting second baseman for this upcoming season. You've got Corey Seager, who everybody and their mother is hoping he's re-signed and is the shortstop for the long term. You've got Justin Turner at third base. And you got Max Muncy at first base. Now, we're going to get to Muncy a little bit later when we get to stock up, stock down. I'll be curious to see. But having trained him as a second baseman, Busch, I guess is what I'm getting at. It's ironic that he might not actually have a spot to play at second base next season if Seager sticks around, if Luck is still there. Depending on the DH, I guess maybe you can move some of those guys around. But will be interesting to watch there as well. And again, to your point on instructionals, I believe it was Michael Grove that I was talking to, and I said, who's the one guy you don't want to face? And he said Michael Busch. He said Michael Busch just has beaten him up. And I'm excited to ask you about Grove next week because he's a guy I'm high on. But we'll get to him next week in the 11 to 100 range there. So Ruiz, kind of a guy I skipped over. It feels like a little bit. I think you used the term prospect fatigue. He has been in the top 100 for what feels like 3 or 4 seasons now. They have Will Smith. We've seen him at the major league level. He's continued to hit in the spring. Any changes in your mind about how good Ruiz may or may not be?
changes from like
Yeah,
last
just in the
year
last
or
couple years. I mean, because again, he's a guy that's been hovering in the as high as like a top 50 prospect in all of baseball in some places. It feels like he's dropping down those lists, not necessarily because of anything he's done, but just because maybe the Dodgers haven't had a place to put it.
yeah, I think that's fair. And you got to remember, this is still a guy who is only 22 years
Totally.
old. He reached Double A at such a young age, and kind of stagnated there. And I think that's what caused a lot of the perception to change around him. But this is still a guy with elite contact skills. He's a great framer. And a lot of times, and Connor Kirkon, who writes for Six Man Rotation, put out a chart a couple of years ago about this. A lot of times when you have these guys who have elite strikeout to walk ratios at a young age, at high levels of the minors, those are the kind of guys with the approach and barrel control to develop power later on. Guys like Mookie Betts, guys like Jose Ramirez, guys like Francisco Lindor, guys who maybe you couldn't project power on them initially, but they're just such good hitters that they eventually will grow into it. That's not saying Keibert Ruiz is going to be a 30 homer type of offensive player, but he should hit enough and he should play defense enough to be a top 20 catcher in baseball. And if the Dodgers have two of those, with alternating catchers, the nature of the position, you can't start that guy 162 games a year. That's really valuable.
You heard it here first. Keibert Ruiz, the next Mookie Betts, straight out of the lips of Justin Lorber, right? Did I hear that correctly? No, I'm just kidding. Well, talk to me about Cartaya, because you've got another catcher on here at number 7. And I remember hearing rumblings over the past couple of years that some people actually think Cartaya, even when pre-Smith making it to the major leagues, there were people saying, hey, yes, Will Smith is up there. Yes, Ruiz is up there. Cartaya is actually the best of the bunch. Now, I don't know, is that talk still out there? Is that something you believe in? How do you, I mean, obviously you've got Ruiz 2 and Cartaya 7. Cartaya is much younger. I think 3 or 4 years younger, still a teenager. So he's got some time to go, but how do you sort of compare those two guys?
So that talk may have been out there before, but I think Will Smith's performance in the major leagues has quieted that down. Diego Cartaya has a ton of upside, but Will Smith is 25 years old and he's one of the best 5 catchers in baseball right now at this moment, maybe even like top 3.
Yeah.
So yeah, Diego Cartaya, I don't think you could comfortably say, oh yeah, he's going to be better than Will Smith.
What about Ruiz? How do you compare him to Ruiz?
He is a lot more physical than Ruiz is, and you can project a lot more power there.
Okay.
He's very confident defensively. He has a great arm. Is polished behind the plate more so than most catchers his age. The upside is there, where Ruiz, you have to project the power on there and hope that the strong hit tool brings that power additionally and can get to maybe 10, 15, 20 home runs. With Diego Cartaya, you can project that onto his body. He looks like a power hitter. He's hit some balls. I know when he was in the AZL back in the summer of 2019, he hit some balls really hard and really far.
Awesome. I mean, it is so fascinating. We talked a little bit about the catcher position earlier. I mean, you look around the major league rosters and who's playing catcher, and it is a freaking wasteland. And so the idea that, and I know the Giants have kind of done the same thing with Zaidi gone there. They've got a couple of their top prospects are also both catchers, and they keep drafting those guys high up. And you've got to assume it's one of those things where it's like at some point somebody is going to come calling, and the Dodgers probably hoping that either they do what you said and, hey, we've got 2 guys and we'll rotate them, and you as a designated hitter in there, and Will Smith's playing 162 games, and, a guy like Ruiz is maybe catching 60 to 70 times a year, or somebody comes calling and gives you 120 cents on the dollar for a catcher in a premium position. So I'll be so fascinated to see how the Cartaya, Ruiz, and again, there's another guy further down this list we'll talk a little bit about next week who could potentially be in that conversation as well. Moving on to number 6, Andy Pages. We joked about, Pages, Pages. We'll go with Pages. He's a guy who fascinates me. You had him 15th in your last rankings. He's a 20-year-old outfielder. And I guess the reason he's interesting to me is because the Dodgers seem to have tried to give him away a year ago. He was part of the trade that would have sent Jock Peterson, Ross Stripling to the Angels. In return, there was really, when you think about what they might have gotten from the Angels compared with what they ended up getting for Stripling straight up and still getting to keep Pages, it's kind of crazy. So I guess I don't know how to phrase this question other than to say it felt weird that the organization was so comfortable giving him up as a part of that trade, and yet you've got him as the number 6 prospect. So what's going on with him?
It was weird. And I can make sense of most of the things that this front office does and has done. Um, I still, a year later, based on the names that I heard at the time, I cannot square what they were going to trade for what they were
Yeah.
getting. And especially when you consider what they ended up getting for Ross Stripling, I am very happy to live in the timeline that we are in, where we got Jocktober last year, helped us win a World Series.
Yeah.
Got, I think, better players in a separate trade for Ross Stripling, and we did keep Andy Paget, who I think may have the highest upside of any player in this top 10, sans Woman Diaz.
Okay. So, and what is it when you say upside? I mean, he's an outfielder. He's 20 years old. Are we talking about a sort of 5-tool player? Are we talking about a power hitter? Are we talking about a defense first guy? What's sort of the entry level scouting report on him?
So Eric Longenhagen of Fangraphs has called Paget the launch angel unicorn. And that's because his average launch angel in 2019, last full minor league season, was 25 degrees, which if you put him in the major leagues, 25 degrees would have led all major league hitters. Wow. And in 2020, it would have been second behind only Joey Gallo. So this is a guy who can lift the ball and hit for power. At the same time, he's a present center fielder. There are questions about whether he ends up there. He's probably a better fit in right field. He has a really strong arm, maybe one of the strongest arms among all outfielders in the Dodgers system. So he's a guy who can absolutely profile in right field. But for now and maybe the next 2 or 3 years, still a guy you can throw out in center and be comfortable with that. And for guys who put up the offensive profile that he has the potential to do and who can play center field, that's a potential all-star player.
And the ETA on him, I mean, I know he's 20 years old. Are we talking 2022, 2023?
Probably 2024.
Okay.
Maybe 2023. I mean, it depends. Guys take big jumps, and we haven't seen so many of these guys in game action for a year and a half. So we don't know, what happened over the last year or so, how well they developed. There are going to be guys who come out this minor league season and set the world on fire because they've worked this entire time to get themselves better. And there are going to be guys who maybe are highly regarded and haven't put in a sufficient amount of work compared to some other guys. He's someone who I'm really high on just because the power upside is there. He's been described as an extremely intelligent young hitter, a guy who knows what he's doing at the plate. And the defensive upside, he's a guy who maybe can stick in center field, but if not, he's going to be a good right fielder. You can feel very confident about throwing him out in right field. And guys with his kind of upside are rare.
One person in the chat asking about Cartaya, asking about his size. He's a tall guy. Is he too tall to stick at catcher in your estimation? Is that something that's been talked about with him?
No, he sits 2, and I think a body comp that he got when he signed was Salvador Perez, who I know is also a bigger catcher, has a really strong arm, good defensively, hits like 20 home runs a year if he's healthy. So I think that would be kind of the body comp that you would look at for someone like Cartaya. And Salvador Perez is a great defensive catcher. So
there you go. Okay, well, let's get to the back end of this, and then we've got a couple questions in the chat we'll get to as well. We don't have time to dig into each of these guys. We've got 3 left. The short version on Diaz, he's a teenager. They just signed. I guess my 2 biggest questions when I look at him is, what's the timeline? So he's not expected to be stateside this year. He's going to be in the Dominican Summer League, it sounds like. And then secondly, just for a newbie like me, what is the success rate on international signing teenagers? I know he was the top ranked teenager, so there's hype around him. But is this a lottery ticket, or is this like a high draft pick?
It's a lottery ticket, but it's one of the ones where you have maybe a 1 in 10 or 15 shot instead of 1 in a million.
Okay.
Like I said earlier, this is a guy who is still 17, who, if you were American, wouldn't be even eligible to be drafted until the summer of 2022. So the range of outcomes for him is, major league superstar and doesn't make it out of A-ball.
Okay.
So super wide variance, but he's also extremely talented, and you've got to feel confident throwing someone with his natural talent and his natural hitting ability into the Dodgers system, into their player development apparatus, because of the work they've done with just all these hitters over the last 5 years.
Cody Hosey, he feels like a polarizing guy in prospect circles a little bit. Why do you think that is? What is it about him that leads people to have so much disagreement? Is he high on this list just because of where he was drafted, or has he sort of earned the right to be drafted, to be posted here in your estimation?
I'd say both. And, it's tough to say earned just because he got injured in his first pro season. wasn't fully playing healthy, I think, at all after he had signed. And we just haven't seen a bunch of him. So a lot of that is pedigree, but a lot of it's also projecting skill. And the reason why he's polarizing is because he's not the most toolsy guy. He doesn't have extreme raw power. His max exit velocities aren't what you would like to see in, kind of power hitting third base archetype. That said, he's a guy who puts the bat on the ball. And again, Dodgers player development. He had such a huge season his redshirt junior year at Tulane, led the NCAA in homers, really was helped by a big swing change that allowed him to hit for more power. And these are the kind of guys that the Dodgers have really done well with. So I think it's a bit of natural talent and also based on organizational fit, which is why I have him there.
Okay. Last but not least, Zach McKinstry. We all know him. I sort of think, it's easy to call him Chris Taylor light, but the point I'm making when I call him that is I think he's a lot closer to Chris Taylor than he is to Kike Hernandez. I think you lose a little bit defensively than compared to what you would have gotten with Kike Hernandez, but I feel a lot better with the offensive profile of McKinstry compared to Kike Hernandez. To me, that's an upgrade. So I'm saying that. I'm not asking you if you say, I'm not telling people that you say that, but how much of that do you agree with? Do you think he's an upgrade over Kike Hernandez as an overall player in 2021?
That is hard to say because we haven't seen him since 2019 when he was playing in AAA with the juiced ball, only a few at bats last year. The way he's hit, the dude just hits. Yeah. His barrel control is insane. I've seen him, the pitch he took today for a home run, just great barrel control. I've seen him take pitches away, up, down. The dude just hits. And to think that this guy was a 33rd round pick less than 5 years ago is really a credit and a testament to the work that he's put in and the work that the Dodgers have put in with him.
Okay, we got a couple questions in the chat, so let's go to these. We got one person asking about Jacob Amaya. Not in your top 10. You've got him at number 12, so not too far outside the top 10. I know there's some places, I can't remember which, I could look that up real quick, but somebody's got him as high as Fangraphs has him 5th overall in the system. So we could talk a little bit more about him, but someone's asking about him now. Your thoughts on Jacob Amaya, maybe what's keeping him from the top 10?
I will say there were versions of this list in the drafting process where he was 9 and 10.
Okay.
So he is not far off at all. He is a guy who does not have necessarily a standout tool. He's not an elite power hitter. He's not an elite runner. He doesn't have an 80 grade arm. But he's a guy who does everything well. He does everything either average or above average. And you boost the profile a little bit because he looks like he can stay at short and he'll be able to play second, third, maybe even outfield if you want to try him there eventually.
Got it.
And has a great approach to the plate, sees a lot of pitches, great pitch recognition. And those are the kind of guys who typically exceed their profile.
Yeah. Okay, one other question we've got before we move on to some spring training stuff. Landon Knack, he comes in at your rankings number 21. What's his ceiling realistically is the question. And tagged on to that, how long of a leash do you think Clayton Beeter has as a starter before they move him to relief pitcher? So what's Landon Knack's ceiling? This is a guy who was basically ignored by the draft process after high school and for the first 4 years of college. He has an unbelievable 5th year, which was shortened. The Dodgers end up going up and getting him in the 2nd round. So what's his ceiling? He's looked good in the spring. And then secondly, Clayton Beeter, a guy that was highly thought of coming into the draft, but as he started to slip, there were rumors. Maybe it's because he's a relief pitcher and not a starter. Some of that seems to have hung around. So Knack and Beeter, your thoughts so far?
So first off, I love both Knack and Beeter. Their rankings are not necessarily saying, "Oh, I don't like this guy." I love both of them. I think both of them have huge upside. Landon Knack can be a mid-rotation starting pitcher. You've seen the fastball. He can get swings and misses with that, which is key in today's game. And I know I keep going back to that, but it's something that I really look for is how well does their fastball play in the zone?
Yeah.
Can they get swings and misses with that? Because that's really indicative of their ceiling these days. Good slider, developing changeup. And I think we've seen the work. I saw on Twitter, someone put a side-by-side of his delivery last year at East Tennessee State. And this year in spring training, you can already see the work that the Dodgers have done with him. Another credit to their development system. And I think he's going to be a guy who, floor, probably middle reliever because of the velocity and the slider. But I think he, should remain a starter. That 51-1 strikeout to walk ratio last year speaks for itself. As for Clayton Beeter, Two phenomenal pitches, fastball, power breaking ball. Question is, does he have a third pitch? Can he throw enough strikes? This is a guy who will be a high leverage reliever if he stays healthy with just those two pitches. And if he's, 30 to 40 command, he doesn't need a whole lot of command because his pitches are that good and the pure stuff is that good. So question is just, can he develop those and can he stay healthy?
And Beater, to be fair for the person asking, is number 11 on your list. So clearly that seems to me to reflect that you have him sticking as a starter, right? I mean, because even as a high leverage reliever, I imagine that would hurt his prospect stock a little bit, right?
He is 11th because maybe aside from Ryan Pepio and maybe even including Pepio, the best two pitch mix of any player in this system, just two 60 to 70 grade pitches. And, he should have been a high leverage reliever, I think, last year on a reliever needy team. If a reliever needy team had drafted him, maybe they would have done what the White Sox did with Garrett Crochet. His two best pitches are that good. So it's just if he can get there, if he can get a third pitch, and if he can throw enough strikes, he'll be a really good starting pitcher.
I'll throw one more question out here, and maybe you can include Beater in this question if you would like to. Of the guys on this list, and we'll go down to a Beater at 11, who is the 2021 season the most important for? Like, who has the most to gain or the most to lose? Because it feels like, and maybe Beater's cheating, because it does feel like in 2021, if there's a minor league season, there's a very good chance we find out whether he's a starter or reliever. So maybe if he's going to be your answer, maybe give me somebody else from the top 10 as well. Somebody on here who the 2021 season is most important to that person.
That's a good question. Most to gain, most to lose.
That's why they pay me the big bucks over here, Justin, is to ask questions like this,
I would say Cody Hosey.
Okay.
We haven't seen him fully healthy yet, arguably, at least in, minor league game action. He'll turn 24 later this summer. He's a bit older than the average college player from his draft class. And that age thing's a factor, at least as it relates to value and the way organizations value age in prospects today.
Yeah.
So I'd say for him, he has the most gain, most to lose. If he can, stay healthy, put up a great season, he'll be right on track. If he, happens to deal with more injury problems or, just doesn't perform up to the standard that I think people expect, he can start to fall behind because he will be 24 this summer.
Got it. Awesome. Well, again, futuredodgers.com. He's got a lot more to talk about. Next week, he's coming back. I don't know if Daniel's going to be with us, but Justin will. I will be back. We'll talk about the rest of the top 100. So tonight, before we finish, we do want to talk a little bit of just spring training baseball. We'll do the couple segments that we've gotten used to over the last few weeks, which is stock up and stock down, as well as Justin's going to help me out with big deal or no deal. So we'll start with stock up, stock down. If you're new, again, this segment is really, really simple. We each pick 3 players that over the last couple weeks, since Justin is its first time with us this year, is basically to say who are 3 guys that either have helped their stock or hurt their stock of late. So Justin, I'll let you pick your first, pick one of your players and who you got for number 1, a guy that's improved or hurt his stock.
So we'll start stock up, start on a positive note. Dennis Santana has looked great. Fastball velocity seems to be up, better body, delivery, a little bit less crossfire, more direct to the plate. He's been throwing a lot of strikes, filling up the zone, getting whiffs in the zone with his fastball, which I really like to see. And looks like he's changed his breaking ball. His breaking ball has added a little more depth, more vertical movement, less horizontal movement, and it looks like it pairs well with his fastball. So he's a guy who has played his way into the conversation for the opening day roster, and it helps that looks like Joe Kelly might not be on the opening day roster because of injuries. Same thing with Brusdar Graterol. So it helps with those 2 guys, potentially not being there, but he's a guy who could play his way into some medium or high leverage appearances early on in the year.
So real quick on him, in this system, we know he's a relief pitcher. Do you still believe in Dennis Santana as a starting pitcher long-term, or is what you've seen make you think, hey, this guy's future's in the bullpen?
I think the long-term, he is a reliever.
Okay. So
especially if he can come out and show, what he's shown so far in spring training in the regular season.
Well, hey, this show has long been Dennis Santana fans. He's one of those guys that I know his numbers have been bad before this year, but I just would watch him pitch and I'm like, there's something about this guy. Like, he just looks the part. His stuff looks nasty, and yet, a ball drops here and a ball drops there, and all of a sudden he's got a big ERA. So I'll go with number 1. I mean, the obvious choice here is Corey Seager, but I will add stock up. I mean, is his stock really gone up? He was the MVP of everything last year. Yes, he has 5 home runs in 6 games. So I'm going to pass on him. And I have bad news. I'm going 3 stock downs tonight. This is like negative Nancy Jeff over here. But I'll start with a guy I kind of hinted at earlier. Max Muncy, stock down. Here's why. He's hitting 095 this spring. He's 2 for 21. He's got 7 strikeouts. And I know what you're thinking. Who cares? Spring training, small sample size, yada, yada, yada. Normally, I agree with absolutely everything there. But here's what I'll say. He hit under 200 last season. He slugged 389 last season. And I'm not saying I'm panicked. I'm not worried about Muncy. The small sample size is starting, but the sample size is starting to grow, okay? He was better in the postseason, 904 OPS in a short there, but I'm starting to get a little nervous about Max Muncy, and he's not helping himself this spring. So that's what I've got. Max Muncy stock down. You any concern for you, Justin, on Max Muncy?
Respectfully, no.
Okay, that's fine.
I think the broken hand thing last year, or whatever was going on with him with his fingers or hands, I think that had an effect definitely on his ability at the plate and his power. And we saw what he did in the postseason. So no, not worried yet.
The postseason in the middle there definitely is like the one saving grace. If he had had a terrible postseason, I think I'd be even more concerned. But seeing him be able to turn it on there, knowing he's got the eye that he does, so I'm with you a little bit there. Okay, number 2 for you, stock up or stock down?
So I'll go stock down, and this person's stock is down not because of their own performance, but just because of others. And so I'm going to go with Mitch White, stock down. We know he's been injured. He hasn't been able to get into a spring training game. And the reason I'm saying stock down is because of how all these other pitchers have done. Jimmy Nelson looks filthy. So maybe if you thought Mitch White is starter number 8 this season, not quite.
Yeah.
If Jimmy Nelson gets onto this roster and they need a starting pitcher aside from their front 7, which is more than any other team has, Jimmy Nelson is the guy.
Yeah.
Josiah Gray has looked good in spring training. Ryan Pepio has looked good in spring training. So Mitch White is a guy who's already on the 40-man roster. He's already 26. He doesn't necessarily have the stuff for high leverage relief, more middle relief, back end starter. And he's a guy who's just in danger of, missing out on opportunities if he can't get healthy. And injuries have been a concern for him throughout his minor league career, as well as inconsistencies. And so he's a guy who just, has to get back onto the field and prove he's deserving of not just a 40-man spot, but a spot on that 26-man roster.
Yeah, it has been fun for me getting to sit with Michael Grove, Josiah Gray, and just to talk to those guys and realize like the depth of starting pitching. And depth is even the wrong word. It's just this next generation that's coming up. You mentioned a number of guys. Andre Jackson's in there. And then you've got the guys they added to the 40-man. Uceda, Carrillo, Ortiz is a guy. I mean, I know some of those guys maybe project more as relievers long-term, but the Dodgers have this batch of pitchers coming. Bobby Miller, Landon Knack. I mean, like Clayton Beeter. So you have all these guys, and the Dodgers, it's sort of like some of these guys have to figure out a way to differentiate themselves a little bit. And Mitch White was a guy, he was kind of the head of that line, but it feels like injuries and maybe missed opportunities have sort of, it's like you said it perfectly. It's not hurt in the big picture. It's more relative to everybody else. Maybe he's not ascending as quickly as everybody else is. Is that fair?
Yeah. And look, this is a guy who the year after he was drafted, the pick looked like a steal.
Yeah.
He just hasn't been able to remain fully healthy, and the stuff hasn't been fully present at the same time.
Yeah. Okay, number 2 for me, another stock down. Edwin Rios, 2 for 17 this spring, no extra base hits, 328 OPS. Look, I love Edwin Rios. I think he's going to smash a ton of home runs. He's proven he can do it at the major league level. I guess the short version here is I just was hoping he'd have a really good spring, that he would kind of cement himself and prove that the ascendancy we're all hoping to see is actually legit and real. And again, I'm not the guy to overreact to spring training. That's basically the entire point of this segment, is to overreact to a week or to 2 weeks. So I'm not worried about Edwin Rios, but for a guy who lost out on the DH that would have helped him get a lot more plate appearances this year, Justin Turner comes back. I don't know if that messes with his head a little bit. I don't know what the deal is, but it's just rare for him. 2 for 17 with no extra base hits and OPS that's so low. I was hoping for a solid spring to get the hype train going for Edwin Rios. We're not seeing it so far. I don't think it's a big deal, but it's not great. Number 3 for you.
All right, number 3, going back to stock up, and it's a guy who I mentioned earlier, Ryan Pepio. We heard the buzz, we heard the rumors about his performance last summer and last fall. and he has shown up to spring training and validated all of that and more. I've been super impressed, enough to bump him up a couple of spots in my rankings. And he's a guy who I am really excited to see this minor league season.
Yeah, it'll be fun to see him outside of the the Dodger camp to see what he does in can he dominate the way that I think some folks are hoping to. Number 3 for me, another stock down, sort of the same theme. AJ Pollock, 3 for 24 this spring, no extra base hits, a 317 OPS. 317 OPS. Just do the math in your head real quick, how hard it is to get to a 317 OPS. Here's the good news with Pollock. He did the exact same thing last year in spring and then went on to have the biggest regular season that he's had for the Dodgers, one of the better regular seasons he's had, period. He's a vet, so hopefully that's what we're seeing here. I think that's the headline for all these guys. Yes, it's spring training, but a lot of these guys just seem to be able to flip a switch once the regular season comes. It's not great for AJ Pollock, 3 for 24, but at the end of the day, not a big deal. And Pollock, Rios, anything that you're seeing out of either of those guys that has you even the slightest bit worried?
I haven't been watching a ton of spring training, so grain of salt. I think the spring training golden rule is, and I tweeted this out a while ago. If a player performs well, the hype is real. If a player performs poorly, it's just spring training and doesn't matter.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Absolutely. And by the way, shout out in the chat, Soulbro1. He says, what's up from Portland, Oregon? I'm in Portland, Oregon. So yes, shout out to Dodger fans in Portland, Oregon. Okay, let's get to the last segment of the night before we may have some time for questions at the end. But this last segment's a segment called Big Deal or No Deal. I'll read you a quote, or in this case, maybe some news items, and you tell me, Justin, is this a big deal to you or not? The number one item on my list is something that Dodger fans are probably excited to hear about, which is this. Clayton Kershaw named opening day starter for the Dodgers in 2021. There was some debate. Will he be the home opener? Will it be the real opener? He gets the real opener nod. Is that a big deal or no deal to you?
No deal. These days, the opening day starter role is largely ceremonial. And, we saw it last year. If it comes down to it and they need a game one starter in a playoff series, it's Walker Buehler. And I think it'll be so again as long as he's healthy.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's entirely ceremonial, which is exactly the reason that Clayton Kershaw should be the opening day starter for the Dodgers every year until his arm falls off. It's like you said, we know he's not the best starting pitcher the Dodgers have necessarily, at least not in a playoff series in a big moment, because that's nothing against Kershaw. It has everything to do with how good Buehler's been. You can make an argument that Bauer is even the number one pitcher on the Dodgers staff, but I'm glad that he's the opening day guy. I love it. I think they even said they didn't want him to do the home opener because that's when they're getting their rings, and so just sort of give him that day to enjoy. So shout out to the Dodgers. I love it. If it's ceremonial, which you and I both agree on, let him do it every single time. Okay, number 2 on this list. Major League Baseball sends Trevor Bauer a cease and desist letter about having his brand's logo visible. He was wearing a t-shirt where he's got his Trevor Bauer logo underneath an unbuttoned jersey. I believe he had it on his belt as well. Justin, you're a lawyer. Big deal or no deal, this letter that MLB sends to Trevor Bauer?
Not a lawyer yet. I will point that out. Okay. So I cannot offer
close
anyone
enough
legal
to
advice. No deal. Don't really care.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we got another Trevor Bauer one here, so get excited. Quote, the first inning, my right eye wasn't focusing well for some reason, so I did some CO2 stuff. Big deal or no deal that Trevor Bauer is, quote, doing some CO2 stuff to get his focus dialed in? I
have no idea what that means. Legitimately no idea.
I am 100% with you. I read this quote and I was like, I don't want to say we've reached peak Trevor Bauer already in spring training, but what in the world? I don't even know. I mean, like, I remember like being in Las Vegas, they've got those oxygen bars where you breathe pure oxygen. And my brother, who's a science guy, is kind of like, look, Jeff, that is the biggest scam in the world. That is complete nonsense. Like, it's placebo effect 101. I don't know what the heck CO2 stuff is. I mean, oxygen is one thing. Carbon dioxide, I'm not really sure. That seems like a bad thing to me, but that's Trevor Bauer. So we've got one more here for you. Dave Roberts, this isn't an exact quote. Dave Roberts was asked about guys who have impressed him, some of the young guys who have impressed him. He mentioned 2 people specifically by name, Tony Gonsolin and Dennis Santana. Is that a big deal to you that those 2 guys, out of the whole group of young guys that have been in my major league camp, that those 2 guys were the ones that got mentioned?
I'll go medium deal. Medium deal. It's the manager's job to hype up guys to the media. He's certainly not going to talk
Yeah.
badly about any of them, especially with the way they've performed. But it just kind of confirms what we're seeing with our own eyes. We've seen the improvements that Dennis Santana has made. I brought it up earlier. So just being able to have him acknowledge that and say, yeah, we see it too, and we're noticing. Uh, you know, that's always good to see.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I think Santana in particular is a guy that a lot of us, especially on this show, we've mentioned a number of times, has looked really impressive. And he's not alone, right? Like Andre Jackson has looked really good. A lot of these guys have looked really good. So I think for Roberts to single out, you went through the exercise that Daniel and I went through last week, which is trying to figure out your opening day roster. And when you get to the back end there, which I'll ask you about in just a moment, yeah, Laura Lara, by the way, wants you to know that medium is not an option in this game. Justin, it's just big deal or no deal, okay? So we can't do medium deal, but Justin's new. He'll have it figured out by next week, okay? But I do think as we're looking for clues there for the back end of the roster, I'm not even saying Dave Roberts is hinting at that, but it's somebody who's trying to figure out, okay, I've got 2 spots for Beatty, McKinstry, Santana, Nelson, Clevenger, whoever, Alexander, all those guys. I don't know. I make a big deal out of it, whether it's meant to be a big deal or not. So let me end with this. We'll do one last question, then we'll be done. I know you predicted your opening day roster. We were tweeting back and forth about it earlier today. The last couple spots on this opening day roster feel about as difficult and complicated as possible. I thought this was going to be an easy exercise, but a couple things have happened. First of all, I was actually not expecting Matt Beatty to be a surefire lock for the opening day roster. And I'm not saying he is, but he has performed very, very well in spring training. He's been playing right field, which is a position they don't have a ton of coverage on beyond Mookie Betts. So I think he's established himself. McKinstry has only boosted his own profile. And then in the bullpen, even with Joe Kelly and Brusdar Graterol, let's say neither of them is available for opening day, you've got to figure out, is there another lefty? I liked Alex Vesia. I think you liked Alex Vesia. Alex Vesia was optioned. So that made me look dumb about 4 days after making that prediction. Clevenger and Alexander are the 2 other left-handed options if they want to go that route. But then you've got to figure out, it's basically, if my math is right, you've got 2 spots for Beatty, McKinstry, Nelson, Clevenger, Santana, and Alexander. If my math is right, I think you get 2 of those people. Is that right? Maybe 3. No, you got 3.
I think it depends whether or not Graterol ends
That's
up
true.
being on the opening day roster.
Okay. So how do you have those guys? I mean, I guess I'll go guy by guy. Is McKinstry definitely on the opening day roster as far as you're concerned?
I think so. I think not just the way that he's played, but the way that the other players have talked about him. I saw an AJ Pollock quote last week, praising his ability at the plate.
Yeah.
And the guy just hits. So, and he plays everywhere. And I think, Matt Beatty can throw him at first, can throw him in corner outfield. Zach McKinstry can play everywhere. And I think that's probably a little more valuable at the start of the season.
Yeah.
And I also think they'll end up going 14 pitchers, 12 hitters, or at least for the opener.
McKinstry's a guy I've always had on there. I started to wonder if, because of Gavin Lux sort of taking the reins of that second base job as they had hoped, it frees up Chris Taylor to be the super utility guy who doesn't have a starting job every day. I wondered if that would actually give them some leeway to say maybe McKinstry starts the season in the minor leagues and we wait to see what happens, only because that brings us to Beatty, who, again, not a guy I'm as high on as maybe some other folks. I don't know. I don't know anybody else who's like pounding the table for Matt Beatty. But he's been really good this spring. He's playing right field. So Matt Beatty, confidence, like, I believe you don't have him on your opening day roster. Is that correct?
No, I don't. I have McKinstry over him.
Okay. And how strongly do you feel about that?
Maybe 60-40.
But he's the next hitter. He's the next offensive player. If they were to go 13-13, Beatty would be sort of number 13 on the offensive side of the ball.
I think it depends, because if you put Beatty on the bench and, it depends who you start. If Chris Taylor is not starting, he's your right-handed bat off the bench, your pinch hitter. If he is starting, you've got a bench of likely Rios, Barnes, Lutz. Am I forgetting? Maybe McKinstry. And then do you go with Matt Beatty? Do you go with someone like Sheldon Noisy, DJ Peters, maybe Matt Davidson to get like another right-handed bat on there? So those are the considerations that I think are probably going through their head, and just, playing matchups potentially later in the game. And Zach McKinstry is valuable in the sense that he can come into a game and you can put him anywhere you need him.
Yeah. Left-handed pitching. I kind of assumed they would have at least a second one in addition to Victor Gonzalez. You know, some people have hinted at maybe David Price is starting in the bullpen. I still think he's going to be a starter to begin the year at least. The more I think about it, the more I wonder, do you need two lefties in the bullpen? I mean, we know this new 3-batter rule is a thing, and that has decreased the value of a guy like Adam Kolarek, who they send out. For you, how big of a deal? I mean, because if they go second lefty, it would have to be either Clevenger or Alexander, it appears like. So for you, would you definitely add a second lefty in there, or do maybe Santana and Nelson grab those last two spots and you just go all righties except for Gonzalez?
I don't think you need a second lefty. If it were me, I'd probably have one, but it's definitely not necessary, especially if you're confident in the ability of guys like Dennis Santana, Jimmy Nelson, or just any of your high leverage guys, Corey Knebel, Blake Trinan, to come in and get lefties out. We know they're confident with Blake Trinan against both sided batters. We saw that last year in the playoffs. We know they're confident in Victor Gonzalez to do that as well. Kenley Jansen is, their quote unquote closer. So he won't be matchups.
Yeah.
And Corey Knebel is another guy who I think when he's on can face batters either side. So it depends. It depends on how confident you are in those guys and how much you want to do matchups early on in the year. Because the reality is all these guys besides Jimmy Nelson have options.
Yeah.
So if something doesn't work or you want to change something, you can do that pretty easy.
So real quick, those four, Clevenger, Alexander, Nelson, and Santana, if you had to pick two on the opening day roster, who would you pick?
Nelson for sure, because, you want to keep the way he's looked. You want to keep him from exercising that opt-out. He's a guy who looks like maybe he could be a high leverage reliever, just fastball breaking ball, the way he's pitched this spring.
It's been remarkable.
And the velocity has been back. And, personally, I like Garrett Clevenger. I'd probably go him just because you know what you have in Scott Alexander. You know he's not a high leverage reliever, maybe even not medium leverage, low to medium leverage guy who can definitely get you a ground ball if you need a double play. But you know what you have with him. You don't necessarily know what you have with Garrett Clevenger, and I think it's worth finding out.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you. I mean, Nelson wasn't on my 26-man roster a week ago, and the more I watch of the guy, the more I'm like, that's foolishness. And again, I think I've read that he doesn't have to be on the opening day roster. I think they have like 2 weeks after opening day before he would have to be on the big league roster. He had a weird quirk in his contract because of just the history that he has with the Dodgers. And so maybe they sort of play with that and give him a couple extra weeks, but it's hard to imagine them just letting him go for nothing. And a lot of guys I talk to, when I talk to the young guys, they all say the Dodgers put the best guys on the major league roster. That's what every single person respects and appreciates. They know that if you do your job and improve and get better and are one of the 26 best, you're going to get a shot. And if you're Dennis Santana, you have to feel like, hey, that's what I've done. And so it'll be interesting. Again, I think you could look at it and say, hey, well, Clevenger's been good and he's a lefty. So it's not to say the Dodgers are screwing him over for somebody else, but if you really do operate that way, it's hard to argue with what Santana has done this spring. So, hey, folks, we appreciate you. We got lots of folks joining on YouTube, Periscope, Facebook. We appreciate you joining us. We've ran a little long, so thanks for staying tuned. That's Justin Lorber. You can check him out at Future Dodgers on Twitter, futuredodgers.com with all his info. Like I said, he's going to be back next week doing the same thing all over again, talking prospects. We're going to do number 11 through 100. He's going to give us 4 sentences on all 100. No, I'm just kidding. We'll focus on probably 11 through 30, discuss some of his favorites, guys that he likes as sleepers down the road. So come back for that, and then we'll continue with our big deal, no deal as we ramp up for the regular season. My name's Jeff Spiegel. This is Dodger Heads presented by DodgerBlue.com. Make sure you're subscribed here, ring the notification bell, and check out Dodger Blue 1958 everywhere on social media. As always, before we go, Vin Scully's going to take us home.
The best team holding a trophy high in the air. The Los Angeles Dodgers, champions of the baseball world.